A common joke amongst those of us in the mental health field is that we are all here for a reason. This is really only a joke insofar as we all laugh a knowing laugh when this is said, because it is so deeply true that no one who works in mental health ends up there on accident. We each have a story that got left out of personal statements, essays for graduate schools, or interviews at our respective places of employment that is just as, if not far truer, than the stories we told that got each of us a foot in the door in our mental health-focused communities. I guess this shows, as well as anything, that there is still a stigma. That there is still fear that if we told these intimate stories that reveal our own struggles, we might not be viewed as professional enough, trustworthy enough, or healthy enough for the field. Thank you. Is that better? I hope that in sharing my own story today, we can start to break down some of that stigma, the barriers, and the inauthenticity it creates. I would like to start off my story by acknowledging that I'm privileged in a whole host of ways, many of which will be on display in this story. There are many individuals here specifically in this country that have had systemic disadvantages where I've had advantages, and I want to own that fully. My story would be vastly and critically different were it not for my privilege, and I do not want my story by any means to overshadow that of those who do not have those privileges along the way. Namely that the intersections between mental health and other parts of identity of my own and others in this story never led to problematic interactions with law enforcement or doctors, both of which I've seen in my own eyes professionally more times than I can count. But that is not my story, not personally anyways. My story is instead one of family, lineage, and truthfully, shame and fear. I knew about mental health and mental illness much earlier on than most people I know. I don't know when I learned explicitly, but it seems as though I've always known that my father was bipolar. When I was little, it was an excuse given as to why Dad didn't always show up when he said he would and was generally unpredictable to me. As I got older, I would come to learn that his disease was well managed, whatever that meant, but also learned more about how bad it had been right around the time I was born. A favorite story in the family was about the time that Dad went on tour with Tony Robbins, trying to become a motivational speaker himself. We talked less about the times when Dad wouldn't get out of bed or would go without a shower or meal other than cereal for weeks at a time. While these stories were told good-naturedly, often humorously, and always as a thing of the past, permanently resolved, though this was not necessarily true, a deep pit welled in my stomach as I feared deeply that what all of these stories meant was that I was doomed. Doomed to be unwell, doomed to lose control of my own mind, my own emotions. And truthfully, at times when our relationship was rocky, I was afraid that I was doomed to be my dad. I remember being a teenager and having fairly normative mood swings, but in those moments, fear and doom would envelop me. I was sure this was it, and I would never be the same again. I would wail on the floor as if bipolar was a monster of epic proportion beating down my door. What I did not necessarily realize then, but I see now, is that this fear that encapsulated me stole from me as well. It stole from me other ways of understanding my father as I narrowed in on this part of his identity. It stole from me more nuanced understandings of the process that we went through together as he shared with me. I see now that much of this time was what catapulted me into my current career. And most intimately, it stole from me a positive and rich relationship with my own emotions. My own perceptions and feelings were the greatest source of my fear, and because of that, I did not take the time to get to know them, listen to them, honor them. And it was this relationship that would take me years to heal. But I did what I think we all do. I kept chugging along in this way because after a while at least, it was the only way I knew how. That was until I entered my master's program here at Point Park and was asked to do a genogram project. After years of finding ways to avoid the subject of my father's side of the family and mental health, and particularly ways to distance my own relationship to it, finally at the age of 22, I was asked to look at it face on, trace its patterns, and connect it to myself. More so, I was asked to do this for a grade, so I really couldn't say no. I reached out to my dad, and we set out on an unexpected journey together. He explained to me that each member of our family was an onion all their own, meaning that there were layers upon layers to peel back. As we explored and peeled, I learned a lot about this family that I kept at arm's length and myself. Looking at the family, one of the most notable things that came out is that my father's name is Albert John Chase III. His name is not nearly all he has in common with both his father and his grandfather. First and foremost, my father, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather, chances are, were all bipolar. Though the name of the diagnosis has changed over the years in our ever-evolving mental health system, family stories point to all of the Alberts struggling with manic depressive episodes. Albert II was an alcoholic, though my father described him as a special man with a larger-than-life persona much of the time, but with dark demons that led to drinking and abuse of others. His father, the first Albert, has been referred to in family folklore as John D. Rockefeller because he often walked around like he owned the world. Again, larger than life. At other times, he would stay in bed for days. The pattern is apparent and far-reaching. All three of these men having bipolar disorder causes more patterns than just a pattern of mental illness, however. It causes a pattern of relationships. My father remembers little about his grandpa Al, so the implications of his relationships in the family are at this time unknown. However, I've been able to draw many connections between my relationship with my father and his relationship with my grandfather. My dad told me stories about having to stand up against his father several times to defend what he believed to be right. Specifically once when he was only 21, so close to the age that I was when we had this conversation. He had to muster his strength and bravery to physically fight his own father in defense of his younger brother and stepmom when his father was drunk and beating on them. I've never had to physically fight my father in this way, but I have fought with him and threatened to cut off ties when he cheated on my stepmom and had other indiscretions. My dad views that altercation specifically as a major turning point in his life, an event that shaped him, saying that it made him brave. In many ways, my own fights with my father have done the same. The times where I've told my father he was wrong, I believe, are what made me brave. In many ways, this conversation made me brave too, facing the thing that scared me the most, our genetics coming to get me. I found some empathy and softness too in this process. As I stopped seeing an overwhelming threat of doomed genetics, I started seeing a pattern of hurt and growth that I felt a certain softness towards. When I asked my dad when his parents got divorced, he said he wasn't sure. But he knew that he was young because he doesn't remember eating breakfast with both his parents or watching cartoons with his dad. My dad moved out before I was 1, so I don't remember these things either with him. I've often wondered, seeing the similarities of my father and his father, the mental illness, the multiple marriages, being an absent father at times, if my father felt bound to the fate of his father, and if it is because they share a name, or at least because that is all he has known. The repetition seen in the genogram seems to point that way. While the pattern seems so strong, something about seeing it on paper and hearing it in my father's voice made it less damning, less scary. It also opened up a new way for me to see the world. I was able to realize, borrowing the words of Walt Whitman, that I'm large, I contain multitudes. And so does my dad. And so do all of the people around me, and that's okay. This transformed into an important lesson that I carry into my personal life, as well as my life and work as a therapist. That sometimes the things we are most afraid of, especially within ourselves, are the things that most need talked about, that most desperately need to see the light of day. If you can say it out loud, it isn't so scary. But contrarily, if we cannot face those parts of ourselves, they grow and expand and become so much scarier. And further, if you can't face it, you can't learn from it. I said early on a bunch of things that my story is not about or comprised of. I have come to realize that my story, or at least this story of mine at this time, is about embracing fear, facing fear and embracing it. The truth is that we cannot live without fear. It is at its core one of our most adaptive emotions. It is that feeling that helps us get the hell out of Dodge when we need to, and for that I'm thankful. I would never want to live without fear. It would be pretty dangerous and problematic, I think. But I also do not want to be controlled by fear. I want to be able to look at it for what it is and use it positively. In thinking about this, I looked for advice from others who face fear more boldly, bravely, and frankly more frequently than I do. And what I found is that these folks aren't living fearlessly either. They're simply choosing what to do with that fear. Alex Honnold, a famous adventure rock climber, says this: "I've done a lot of thinking about fear. For me, the crucial question is not how to climb without fear. That's impossible. But how to deal with it when it creeps into your nerve endings." And that's what I would like my takeaway from today to be, that we get to choose what we do when we feel the tingle of fear spread through our body.